Thank you for joining us today for the Southern Legislative Conference webinar entitled Waste Storage and Water Contamination. I am Ann Roberts, Policy Analyst for the Southern Legislative Conference, the Southern Office of the Council of State Governments in Atlanta, Georgia. I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists for setting aside time from their very busy schedules to be here with us and for enlightening us on their legislative responses to water contamination caused by waste spills. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. You are all in listen-only mode. If you wish to ask a question, please use the question box on your GoToWebinar toolbar. You may type in a question at any time during the webinar, and we will get to them at the end. This webinar will be recorded on the CSG Knowledge Center website, knowledgecenter.csg.org, and on the SLC website, slcatlanta.org. Finally, please understand that the views expressed in this webinar are not necessarily the views shared by or expressed by SLC. Rather, webinars are intended to serve as a platform for discussion. In SLC member states, the coal and chemical industries are essential to state economies. Because of the importance of these industries to the region, both in terms of economic development and employment opportunities, legislators are often faced with balancing business interests with the need for environmental protection and conservation. Hazardous spills in two SLC states, West Virginia and North Carolina, have focused attention on this careful balance. This webinar will examine the spills in those states and the subsequent legislative action taken by each state. Understanding how these state legislatures reacted can help other SLC states respond quickly and effectively if faced with similar challenges. We are fortunate today to have an excellent panel with us. Our first presenter is Senator John Ungar II. Senator Ungar was elected to the West Virginia State Senate in 1998 and was appointed Senate Majority Leader in 2011. Senator Ungar served as chair of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure during the 78th and 79th legislatures, as vice chair of the Committee on Economic Development during the 79th legislature, and as vice chair of the Commission on Interstate Cooperation during the 78th legislature. During his tenure, the Transportation Committee was expanded to the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. While chairman of this committee, he sponsored groundbreaking legislation including the Community Empowerment Transportation Act, the Electronic Telecommunication Open Infrastructure Act, and water protection legislation. In addition to transportation and infrastructure legislation, Senator Ungar sponsored the creation of the State Division of Energy, anti-animal cruelty legislation, and numerous education bills. Senator Ungar also serves as the chair of SLC's Education Committee. Our second presenter is Representative Charles McGrady from the great state of North Carolina. He first joined the House of Representatives in 2011 and is currently serving his second term. Representative McGrady serves on 11 committees in the House and is vice chairman of the Appropriations, Environment, and Judiciary Committees. He has a long and distinguished history of community service and activism on behalf of the environment, youth, and the less fortunate. Each of our presenters will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. Please feel free to submit your questions as they come up throughout the program, and we will try to answer as many as we are able at the end. If time does not allow us to answer all questions, please email your questions to me, and I am sure our presenters would be happy to provide an answer. And without further ado, Senator Ungar, you now have the floor.
Oh, thank you very much, Ann, and thanks for inviting me. I'm John Ungar, State Senator from West Virginia. I just wanted to go over the background of what precipitated Senate Bill 373, and then also go into the process of it, and then I'm going to, of course, be open to any questions from that. But on January 9th of this past year, residents started to notice an odor, a licorice smell, coming from the water, and actually DEP immediately responded. what had occurred is there was a company just right up front, about 1.6 miles from the intake of the West Virginia American Water Company, called Freedom Industries. And it was a company that was actually holding in their tanks a chemical with MCHM. And this was near Charleston, but 1.6 miles up the stream from there. And in there, they had MCHM and PPH. This was a cleaning agent for coal, and it was being stored close to the intake. Very little information was actually provided in regards to this storage facility, even though it was so close to an intake, because West Virginia, come to find out, didn't have much regulation on above-ground storage tanks. What happened is this chemical leaked into the Elk River and then eventually got to the intake of the American Water Company, and it ended up polluting the water of over 300,000 customers, which is 9 counties in the area, and the Kanawha County and surrounding counties. Of course, Kanawha County is the seat of government in West Virginia. This then precipitated actually the Senate Bill 373 to be introduced in the Senate. And I was the lead sponsor of that piece of legislation, primarily because I chair the Legislative Oversight Commission on State Water Resources. And so we proceeded in putting forward legislation that did a number of things. First, before I get into the different aspects of the bill, I want to say that this was introduced almost a week after the spill occurred or was identified, and it went through the legislative process pretty much the 60 days it took for that piece of legislation to go through both chambers. But it was also bipartisan, and it ended up being a piece of legislation that was voted on several times in both chambers, and each and every time was unanimously voted in both the House and the Senate. So it had broad-based support. Senate Bill 373 basically has 3 components to it. One part of the bill relates to the legislature's final review and approval of the West Virginia Water Resources Management Plan. And if you could turn to the next slide. This was a plan that started back in 2004 when West Virginia was looking at our water resources and protecting our water resources, particularly after the U.S. Supreme Court case of Virginia versus Maryland over the Potomac, where Maryland owned the Potomac, but Northern Virginia, because of its growth, wanted to withdraw larger quantities of water, and Maryland said no, they didn't want to permit that. So of course they went to the Supreme Court. Out of that case, it demonstrated that states needed to do 3 things in order to protect their water resources. The first part was to actually claim the water resource as a resource for the state. West Virginia had not done that, and so we proceeded to do that. The second is to take an inventory of the water resource, and the third is to develop a water resource management plan to be put in place. And so part of this piece of legislation, actually after those, since 2004, there's been studies, and we looked at the scientific aspects of our management plan, and this was part of Senate Bill 373 was the completion and the adoption of that plan. The remaining portion of the bill reflected more of a comprehensive approach to identify and address future contamination threats to public water supplies. These measures were undertaken to address what the legislature identified as perceived vulnerabilities, which were exposed by the recent Freedom Industry tank leak and a broader lingering impact that the leak had on the affected water supply and the consumers who actually received those supplies. And so the first step of the bill, of course, reflected the changes of the public water utilities, which draw their water supplies from the surface waters like rivers and streams to take a more comprehensive review of their system and their ability. And if you could turn to the next slide, please. So out of that, it's to look at the overall comprehensive aspects of those who are taking into it. But the first part was the above-ground storage tanks that were there that had not been regulated. We have regulations in West Virginia on the below-ground storage tanks, but there weren't very much on the above-ground. So the first thing we had to do was to take an inventory of what do we have out there. We didn't even have that information of how many above-ground storage tanks were present. So that was the first requirement, that anybody with above-ground storage tanks that is not already presently being regulated under another type of legislation or rule would actually have to register their tanks with the DEP. The second part is that we empower the Department of Environmental Protection to set up the standards, to adopt the standards of what the new and, of course, the older tanks, what standards would have to be in place. And then, of course, we put penalties in place, put penalties in place if these things are not followed through. What occurred on the above-ground storage tanks is we had to have registration, which would say exactly where the tanks were located, the size of the tank, what was in the tank, and also we required that the companies would have a mitigation plan in place in the case of if there was any leakage to that. Next slide, please. In the areas of the water utilities, we looked at our water utilities, and many of our utilities we found that did not have a contingency plan in how to react to any type of leak, any type of contamination of their water supply. And so we put in place that they will have to submit a source water protection plan by July 1st of 2016. In that plan, they must be able to actually demonstrate that if there was a contaminant identified, how they would respond, and also what other resources or how they could get water supplies to their customers in case of one of their intakes was actually taking in some contaminated water. The state agencies that were involved in this, the Bureau of Public Health, actually is to assure public water systems in order to meet the federal safe drinking water standards. Along with the Bureau of Public Health, we continued with the Wellhead and Source Water Protection Grant Program. This is a program in which we had allotted $1.5 million so that the public water utilities could utilize this as a grant process in order to update their water protection plans that were supposed to be in place shortly after 9/11, where the federal government required many of these, but they had done them but had not kept them updated. This grant program, of course, will be prioritizing the highest probability of contamination, those areas that we identify that are either with certain types of chemicals that are toxic, and also the proximity to those facilities of above-ground storage tanks, et cetera, to the intakes of these actually public water utilities. Also in this Senate Bill 373, the Bureau of Public Health will work with the Center for Disease Control and others to take on an initiative of the long-term medical monitoring of the population of the over 300,000 people that had been contaminated back in early January. Next slide, please. Along with DHHR, DEP, and Public Service Commission and Homeland Security and Emergency Management and all the local health departments, this legislation clearly outlines each of their responsibilities and also talks of how they will coordinate in order to set up successful planning and implementation in the entire system. You would think that that would have already been done, but during the crisis that occurred with the January 9th spill, that actually we had a lot of finger pointing and people saying that they did not have the authorization to do certain things. And so with this legislation, we wanted to make it very clear what each department, what they were responsible for, and also in how they would go about coordinating their activities. Next slide, please. We also established a Public Water Systems Supply Study Commission that's made up of both of governmental and non-governmental private citizens with certain expertise in order to look at the overall system and to report back to the legislature and the governor in what needs to be done in order to implement Senate Bill 373. Also, we have a process in West Virginia, the Legislative Rulemaking and Review Committee, that will be taking on various rules from the various agencies in order to get in more detail on the implementation of Senate Bill 373. And the Committee of the Joint Legislative Oversight Commission on State Water Resources, the one that I chair, we will continue to provide oversight in all these departments that are actually dealing with Senate Bill 373 and also the implementation of the State Water Resources Management Plan. Also, the EP continues to report back on a monthly basis on their progress as far as their above-ground storage tank program, how the regulations being implemented, and also if there's any need for additional legislation in order to fulfill some of the overall arching initiatives laid out by Senate Bill 373. Next slide, please. With that, I just wanted to say that what we tried to do is we took into overall the response to not only the spill to look at the above-ground storage tank, but also we identified the vulnerability that we had with our water resource, and particularly in how we manage it, how we protect it. And with that, I will say that from my experience of talking with others throughout the country, in other states, what happened in West Virginia isn't necessarily something that only could have happened in West Virginia. To tell you the truth, I think each of our states are very vulnerable in this area because in a lot of ways we've always taken water for granted. It's been there, it's been available. However, there's a vulnerability in our water supply, in our water infrastructure. And so with that, that was definitely evident in West Virginia with our spill. So what happened in West Virginia could have happened anywhere in the country. And I say that here in the state, that we're not going to be judged by the fact that on January 9th this happened to us, but what we're going to be judged on is how we responded to this disaster, and what ways are we going to go forward. And particularly in the sense that we have to get the balance, as it was mentioned earlier with Ann saying, a balance between our energy industry and our environment. We do not want to over-regulate in any ways. We wanted to try to close the loopholes that were in place in order to provide public the confidence of protecting their water resources, which not only is essential for the well-being of health and well-being of the citizens, but also is very critical to economic development. I'm talking with a number of corporations, and particularly manufacturing, that they want to be assured that the water supplies that they're taking in does not have some other type of foreign chemical in there that could very well also cause economic problems for them in their production. And so with that, we put this in place in order to ensure that the protections were in place, and also that the rest of the country and the rest of the world knew that West Virginia was moving forward to protect our water resources. I appreciate the opportunity to talk and then look forward to any questions later on.
Thank you, Senator Unger, for those enlightening remarks. Representative McGrady, you now have the floor.
Glad to be here, and Senator Unger's remarks tie very closely to my remarks on a similar issue. A year ago, we had no idea that we would be looking at passing coal ash legislation, but something occurred, and in our case, in February of last year, and by the end of the legislative session, we had passed the first in the nation coal ash management legislation. First slide. I want to just give you an overview of what I intend to do here. First, give you a bird's eye view of the legislation. Secondly, give you a little primer on coal ash, and then tie that directly to North Carolina and where we were, and what the impetus for the legislation was, and then key facets of the legislation and whatever, there's some number of outstanding issues. Next slide. Coal Ash Management Act, in a nutshell, it establishes a comprehensive legislative framework for the management of coal ash. It requires remediation of groundwater at all these ponds owned by Duke Energy here. Required the closure of 4 of the named ponds by 2019, and set up really a process for closure of the remaining ponds based on a staggered schedule once they're determined whether they're high risk, intermediate risk, or low risk. Next slide. The coal ash, just 101, so you understand the context. Coal ash is obviously the byproduct of the production of energy from coal. It contains numerous toxic substances, but it isn't currently considered a hazardous waste, and so states typically deal with it as a solid waste. As a liquid, it's stored in ponds, and as a solid, it's typically put in landfills. Next slide. The historical framework here is there is no federal regulation specifically governing coal ash. There are federal regulations, however, being considered. Federal EPA is under a court order to issue some regulations by the end of the year. Historically, North Carolina has responsibility for coal ash ponds because these ponds discharge treated wastewater into the surface waters and are therefore regulated under the NPDES permit system. The coal ash ponds are also are impoundments, and they've been impounded, and therefore they're covered by the state's dam safety program. Next slide. The bigger picture for North Carolina is there are 33 coal ash ponds at 14 different plants across the state, both active and retired plants. These ponds together house a total of more than 107 million tons of coal ash, and that's been generated, certainly continuing to be generated, but it's been generated over the last 50, 60 years, and even some of the ponds are older than that. They're typically located by significant surface waters because the water is needed for the generation of the electrical plant, and so they often sit very close in proximity to the state's major waterways. Next slide. This gives you a picture of the state, shows you the various sites and where they're spread out, and what I'd say about it is you can notice quickly they're all over the place, and they're in very different zones of the state. The plants that are near the coastal area are sitting right around sea level, just not far above sea level, oftentimes actually sitting in the water table. The Piedmont area is sitting up more, typically along rivers, and then the mountains, you're talking about steep slopes. Next slide. What gave why we have this legislation is the Dan River spill that occurred in February of this year, and a corrugated metal pipe, stormwater pipe, under one of the ponds that Duke Energy, I don't believe, actually knew was there, ruptured, and provided a way for the water and the ash to get into the river. 38,000 tons of coal ash and 27 million gallons of water were released into the Dan River, and Duke immediately began to try to mobilize to stop the release. The site itself is very close to the state of Virginia, and you had a number of agencies, federal and state, immediately begin work to effect a cleanup. EPA has entered into an agreement with Duke to provide a comprehensive assessment and try to figure out exactly what has been damaged. This, again, is right at the border between North Carolina and Virginia, so it was actually a multi-state effort that occurred. Next slide. This gives you a picture of it. You can see the pond up on the right has not leaked. The one immediately below it is the pond that leaked, and you can see at the river the coal ash in the river. Next slide. This is a picture, again, on the top is what it looked like before the rupture, and on the bottom is what the rupture looked like. Next slide. And finally, this is where the pipe took the coal ash and the water into the river, and you can see the river has a two-tone color to it, and that's these pictures are taken the day of the spill. Next slide. So the Dan River spill brought, like the spill in West Virginia, brought into stark relief the precarious nature of coal ash storage in North Carolina, led to the passage of the Coal Ash Management Act, and it's a very large bill, very comprehensive, and I'm just going to try to give you an overview. Next slide. As I noted, the legislation establishes a comprehensive regulatory scheme for management of coal ash, including standards for closure and how we're going to remediate the ponds that are in place. Next slide. One of the major issues, and I'll return to this later, relates to cost. The bill prohibits the state's utility commission from allowing an electric public utility to recover from the customers costs related to unlawful discharges to the waters of the state. And that's what this was in Dan River. And Duke Energy has basically said that they will cover the cost of the cleanup here. Next slide. The bill creates the Coal Ash Management Commission. This is the idea here was that there wasn't a lot of faith in our Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and there was a feeling that we needed Duke to put forward plans to address coal ash, have those plans reviewed by the regulatory agency, but actually also have a check and balance on the regulatory agency. So ultimately, this new Coal Ash Management Commission will review and approve prioritization, classification, and closure plans for ash ponds. Next slide, please. More about the bill. It requires the assessment of groundwater and implementation of corrective action for the restoration of groundwater quality at all ponds. We suspect, although we don't know, that literally all these ponds are leaking in one fashion or another. And so ultimately it will require the pond owner to survey drinking water supplies located within half mile of the pond and provide alternative water sources for drinking water if it's found to be contaminating. And it requires Duke to identify, assess, and correct on all unpermitted discharges from ponds to protect the surface waters of the state. Next slide. The key part of the bill has to do with prioritization. We have all of these various different ponds, 33 different ponds. Some of them are higher risk than others. And so by December 31st of next year, all ponds need to be prioritized based on the risk to the public health, safety, and welfare. And we basically have set up a low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk prioritization. DENR will establish the prioritization subject to the Coal Ash Commission's approval. Next slide, please. And the question then, of course, would be, well, how do you prioritize the cleanup of one pond versus another? And here's on the slide the list of what is to be considered in prioritization. And nothing here should surprise anyone. It's based on the hazards to public health. It's based on the structural condition of the dam, the impoundment. The location of the impoundment, for example, above public intake areas, the amount of coal ash and its characteristics, whether the pond is located within an area subject to flooding. So again, the idea here is to put the effort first on the ponds that are the most significant risk. Next slide. From prioritization, the next step will be closure. High-risk ponds must be closed no later than the end of the year 2019. Intermediate ponds in 2024, and low-risk ponds in 2029. And the major issue that got a lot of discussion is whether there are some of these ponds that are low risk, and whether the best thing to do with them would be to cap them in place, basically put a liner over the top of them to keep water from infiltrating through the pond. Obviously, if you don't need to dig up the pond, it's not going to be as costly for whoever ends up having to pay for the pond's cleaned up. So one of the major issues was with respect to these low-risk ponds, and with some group of players on the outside pushing very strongly to not provide for low-risk ponds and basically have all of the pond sites by law dug up and moved. I should add that all the closure plans here are originally put forward by Duke, approved by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, but they ultimately have to receive final approval from the Commission. Next slide. Specifically, the bill provides for the closure of 4 named plants. These were named in the bills. And the ponds will be dewatered, all ash removed and transferred either into a landfill or for use as structural fill. Obviously, if groundwater is degraded as a result of the pond, corrective action needs to be taken. Next slide. The whole process, closure process, provides a lot of opportunities for public input and appeal at multiple steps. And I'd say that the deadlines that are set in the bill are firm. The Coal Ash Commission has some limited ability to flex some of the dates, but we didn't want to give much flexibility in that regard. Next slide. One of the issues relates to, next slide there, structural fill. Prior to this event at Dan River, some amount of coal ash was being used for structural fill, but there was no process to it. So the bill now provides for individual permits when coal ash is going to be used for structural fill projects of a certain size, encapsulation and a liner system constructed when structural fill is used, groundwater monitoring, financial assurance, and some assurance that these structural fill sites will continue to be looked at over time. Next slide. There are a number of other provisions that are noteworthy. We're just trying to get out of coal ash ponds, and so we want to have coal ash, which is a byproduct, be used in a beneficial way to the extent possible. But rather than adding water to dry ash and turning the dry ash into a pond, we're basically going to prohibit the construction or expansion of any ponds, and over time eliminate them. We have a number of different requirements in the bill all set out here that make it very clear what the public policy of the state is over time. I would note also, though, that the state law preempts local government regulation on the management of coal ash, and that's real important. Next slide. Some remaining issues. As I indicated, there will be, there's an expectation of federal rules in December. The EPA is under court order to come forward. If the feds come forward and determine that coal ash is a hazardous waste, frankly, North Carolina is going to have to revise this law substantially. But the expectation is that it will be more likely handled as a solid waste, in which case North Carolina's law will not need that significant change. Again, one of the major issues relates to cap in place. Some group of people would like to see all these coal ash ponds dug up. The law that we've passed basically provides for a study of all the ponds, a prioritization of them, and a determination whether, in fact, we need to clean them all up. The biggest residual issue is who's going to pay for the cleanup and the cost, and whether it gets allocated to the ratepayers or to Duke Energy's shareholders. Next slide. And these are the big issues: the cost and the extent of the cleanup, and they're really intertwined, as I'll show you in the next few slides. Next slide. What is surprising, and I suspect this is true in many different states, is just the amount of coal ash that we're talking about here. And this is a slide that shows the Dan River cleanup, assuming one truck every 3 minutes, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. How long would it take to move all the coal ash in Dan River? And you see about 2 years. The Dan River, though, is a very small site. The largest site is the Marshall site. And again, assuming one truck every 3 minutes, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, this is Duke Energy's projection, it would take over 25 years to move all of that coal ash. Gives you a sense of the problem. Next slide. You will remember I said that the cost issue is tied up with what it is we're going to do, how we're going to clean this up. Again, this is a Duke Energy produced slide, but I think it gives you a pretty good sense of just depending on how you clean up and what the extent of the cleanup is, the costs are going to be significant. At the very least, we're looking at cost of over $2 billion. And at the most, assuming we were to dig up all of the coal ash at all the various sites, and move it some distance and put it in lined landfills, the cost could come up to approaching $10 billion. Next slide. I don't know, the thing that most surprised me about the coal ash issue and the coal ash ponds was just the variety. The difference between a coal ash pond sitting in the mountains and the difference from a coal ash pond sitting on a river near the ocean. This is a coal ash pond, the picture here. One of the state's major heron rookeries turns out to be a coal ash pond. The coal ash is actually under all those trees. There's a pond on the other side, so it's a mixture of a coal ash landfill and a coal ash pond. And it gives you, I think, a sense of just how different the problem is. Each of these ponds have got to be dealt with on an individual basis. They're each going to need individual plans modeled to address their specific issues. There's a lot we don't yet know, but we do know that we need to get moving on this. The problem we've got here has been one that has built up over decades, nearly a century actually, and the public expectation that we can pass a law and fix this in one fell swoop, it can't be done. So in talking to all the various parties, I asked them to take a deep breath. I expect that the coal ash legislation that we passed this past session is really just the first step. And we're going to have to probably figure out, or someone is going to have to figure out, maybe the State Utilities Commission, how it is and who is going to pay for the cost of the cleanup mandated by the bill. And I'll stop right there. The next slide has my contact information, and if anyone has any questions about coal ash or how it's being managed in North Carolina, please don't hesitate to contact me.
Thank you, Representative McGrady, for that excellent presentation. We received several questions during the webinar, and the first question goes to Senator Unger. Senator Unger, you mentioned that the chemicals involved in the spill was relatively unknown and unstudied. Given the lack of information on this chemical, how have stakeholders prepared for and undertaken cleanup and decontamination efforts?
Well, the response had been primarily the chemical actually ended up, or the chemicals ended up going through the water supply system with the West Virginia American Water Company, and that the response initially was to put out a do not use warning from the governor, and at that point there was a whole process of trying to flush these particular chemicals out of the system that took a number of weeks and even months in some areas. And the National Guard was part of testing various, testing in the water and seeing where the chemical levels were. And the Center for Disease Control came in and advised the state. But it was quite a mess because the West Virginia American Water Company decided not to shut down the intake, and that's what, of course, precipitated, or that's what caused us to put in Senate Bill 373 provisions in there that the public water utility companies need to have alternative means of water, just in case an intake is, or this water that's coming into an intake is contaminated. But that whole process, and we still don't know the effects that these chemicals have on humans, and that's still being studied. But that's part of the long-term medical monitoring that we have in place with the local public health departments, Bureau of Public Health, the State Bureau of Public Health, along with the Center for Disease Control. And so with that, it was a long, drawn process to really try to
to flush it out of the system. In regards to the cleanup in the river, DEP and emergency management and Homeland Security tried to contain as much of those chemicals as they were going down the river. But how successful they were, we don't know. And so all that's still undetermined as far as the response. And it comes down to the breakdown. That's where the agencies were all confused of their particular responsibilities and authority. And that's the importance of Senate Bill 373, is to clearly lay out and put that responsibility and that authority into the various agencies of how they will respond in any future situation like this. We're hoping that the protective measures we put in place would ensure that we never have anything happen like this again in West Virginia. However, if it would happen, I think we're better prepared today than we were, of course, on January 9th.
Thank you, Senator Unger. Our next question is also for Senator Unger. Once individual mitigation plans have been created, do owners of above-ground storage tanks have an obligation to file these plans with the DEP?
Yes, they're required to register the tanks that they have and the specifics of the chemical. Also, they're required to have those plans also to DEP for review, and also in cooperation with the Bureau of Public Health. But primarily, they have to meet certain standards. Now, one thing I wanted to point out that I didn't in my presentation, that the way we're prioritizing some of this is there are these zones of critical concern, and those are these facilities that are closest to intakes throughout the state. And those above-ground storage facilities are going to have more scrutiny in the sense that the owners of the tanks have to get them inspected on an annual basis. But actually, those in zones of critical concern, DEP would also come in and have inspectors. And those zones travel if there's a spill. They calculate the flow of the water, and that within 5 hours, if a chemical would reach an intake, they would be in that zone of critical concern. And so, but yeah, they're required to have those plans reviewed and also their tanks inspected.
Thank you, Senator Unger. Our next question is for Representative McGrady. Representative McGrady, does the North Carolina legislation address the possibility of groundwater contamination?
Yes, it is one of the major concerns, and Duke Energy initially, in putting forward its plans and its proposals for closure of each of these sites, is responsible for providing some groundwater monitoring and also take into account how the coal ash pond is affecting groundwater. If in fact it is affecting groundwater, remediation is going to have to be part of the closure plan. And if groundwater is being affected, it is much more likely than not that that coal ash pond will be among the first coal ash ponds that is closed and remediated, because that's the purpose of the law, to protect both groundwater and the surface waters of the state.
Thank you, Representative McGrady. We've got time for one more question, and our last question also goes to Representative McGrady. Does North Carolina's legislation allow utilities to recover the cost of coal ash removal and pond closure?
That's the hard question. The answer is yes and no. In one specific instance, that is with respect to Dan River, It's clear that the costs of the closure and remediation will not be borne by the ratepayers. And in fact, anywhere where any of these ponds are unlawfully discharging into the surface waters or polluting the groundwaters, my belief is that those costs will not be permissible. Ultimately, it's a decision by the Public Utilities Commission. The General Assembly, though, in this legislation did not specifically address, other than, as I've mentioned, the cost issue. And it is this is the political season, and that issue is probably one of the issues, the hot political issues that are still being discussed. And when the General Assembly comes back into session early next year, my expectation will be that at least some of my colleagues will be pushing to have the General Assembly decide, what portion of the cost of this cleanup, closure, and remediation will be borne by the ratepayers, and what portion should be borne by the Duke Energy shareholders. I would note, just in passing, I mean, we still have coal ash, coal-fired power plants being used in the state. They're still generating coal ash, and some of them are adding water and putting them in coal ash ponds. No one suggests that current generation of electricity, the costs of coal ash ought to be borne by the shareholders. And so we're going to, ultimately, I think we're going to end up somewhere in the middle on that issue, with the cost spread between the shareholders and the rate base.
Thank you, Representative McGrady. We're running out of time and have to wrap up the webinar, so please forward any questions you have to me, and I will work on getting a response from our presenters. I'd like to thank both of our speakers today for their wonderful contributions, and also my CSG colleague, Carrie Abner, for her help with all the technical aspects of this webinar. Thank you to all of you for spending an hour of your afternoon with us. I hope you found this webinar useful and informative. If there is anything more that CSG or SLC can do for you and your work, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thanks again, and have a wonderful afternoon.